Hello and welcome back. So in this video, what we're going to do is take a quick look at CSS before we start diving into writing our parser. Now, it's very important to have an understanding of CSS as we move forward into putting together our CGS language for the simple fact that CGS is built on the idea of CSS. We want our language to mimic it, so those that are comfortable with CSS will have absolutely no problem working with CGS for styling their GUIs. So this video is really targeted towards those that do not have a familiarity with CSS. If you do, feel free to go ahead and skip over to the next video. I don't think you'll be missing out on anything important. But for those of you that need a quick intro to CSS, here it is. Nelson?
All right, so CSS is basically a way to apply particular style properties to individual elements within a document. Now in HTML, those elements are represented with, well, the HTML syntax, which you can see here over on the left. And for example, this hello world text is nested inside of an H1 element. So whenever you see the angle brackets, you know that you're looking at an element. And then when you see a slash in the angle brackets with the element name, that is the closing tag for that element. So the individual items within the angle brackets are tags, and the entirety of the things in between those tags, including those tags, are called elements. The goal of CSS is to be able to selectively apply style or properties, style information, to individual or multiple elements within a document. So you'll see over here we have a style sheet. So this is what CSS looks like. This will usually be included in the structure with a special tag that we'll look at later. But so going through the different elements of a style sheet, you'll see that they are broken into what are called rules. Each item that you see here in this box is a rule, and a rule is made up of two different things. A selector or multiple selectors, and you'll see those highlighted right here. Those are the special, the text before the open curly inside of a rule, and they do have special meaning that we'll go over. The next bit that makes up a rule is a list of 0 to many properties, and a property is going to be the individual attribute that our rule will apply to any element that is selected by the selector. So to kind of break apart how CSS or how a few of the different kinds of selectors work in CSS, we can visualize it here with this. You'll see that this is a element selector, which means that it will select any element that is of this type. And in this case, this is an H1. You'll see that this H1 becomes selected. Now the reason this is an element selector is because it has no punctuation before the selector itself. That makes an element selector, and therefore any elements of that type will be selected. So what happens is when this style sheet is applied, it will find that this H1 selector selects this one element within this document, because there's only one H1 element within this document, and then applies this property to the content within that element. So if I go ahead and look at another example, you'll see a little bit of a more complex selector. Now if you look over in the structure real fast, you'll see that these elements have something called attributes on them. So for example, this div element has a class attribute with the value of columns, whereas this div element has a class attribute of the value column. And so you'll see that the CSS selector can actually, you can think about them being nested. You can say that basically, if I were to read this selector out in English, select every element that has the class of column, and that's because it has a dot in front of it. That punctuation means that this is a class selector. So it means select every element that has the class of column that is an immediate descendant of any element that has the class of columns. And that's what this greater than sign means. If this greater than sign wasn't there and was instead space, that would mean any descendant. But the greater than sign means that it has to be immediate descendant.
So the very next thing, basically.
Yep.
Okay.
And you'll see that represented here because this div, which has a class of column, is nested directly under this div that has the class of columns.
Mm-hmm.
So if I click forward one more time, you'll see that this attribute padding of 5 pixels is applied to the content within this element that was selected. So now when this element is rendered, the rendering engine knows to apply 5 pixels of padding around the content inside of it. So to look at the next selector, it's the same sort of thing, except for now we're combining an element selector with 2 class selectors and joining them with the immediate selector or the immediate descendant modifier. And you'll see that this H2, this selector will only match an H2 if it is immediate descendant of an element with the class of column, and it'll only match if that class element with the class of column is an immediate descendant of an element with the class of columns. And if this selector does get matched, then this style, or if there were more than one properties, these properties would get applied to the content within.
Now, this is just to show how specific you can get in targeting a particular element, correct?
Yes.
I mean, you don't have to be quite this complex in saying this must be a descendant of this, must be a descendant of this, if I want to change just the font of this one thing. If, let's say, you want it to affect all of columns or all of column, all throughout, you wouldn't have to be so specific, correct?
No. Being specific is just, when you're designing your structure and your style sheet, you're going to have to decide, do I want to select an element inside of this one particular context, or do I want to style this element in a more general context? And you'll see the power of that later, where you can style a bunch of generic elements in a way that you want, and then selectively change those properties with more specific selectors.
Okay.
So let me go ahead and fire up a basic example. I'm just going to jump over here into a window and create 2 files. I'm going to create my index.html file and my styles.css file. So these are just empty text files, and I'm going to show how the selector syntax can select against elements in a document. And I am spending a lot of time on the selectors, but they're the most important aspect of CSS and CGS. Understanding how specific you can get with selectors will make your style sheets a lot more concise and a lot more powerful. So I'm going to go ahead and break this up into a split view, and then I'm going to launch this document in a Chrome window, bring over my notepad, pin it to the top, and now you can see the result of my HTML file, which I call the structure, and my CSS file, which contains the styles. So to start out my HTML file, I'm just going to go ahead and dump in a few basic elements. Now, this isn't a lesson about HTML, so I'm omitting as much as I can do. There are some other elements that you would be required to do if you're doing an actual HTML development, blah, blah, blah. But the point of this is about CSS.
Right.
So then I'm going to go ahead and link in a style sheet. So this link tag, will import the styles expressed in the style sheet into this current document. So the next step is I'm just going to start with something basic. Basic document with one element that says hello world, and it's an H1 element. And you'll see the browser kind of adds some default styling to this element. H1s are particularly large and bold, and H2s are, slightly smaller and so on. But with CSS, you can override any of those attributes. So if I wanted my H1 tag, or my H1 element, to have a font size of 11 points, I can go ahead and see that reflected right there. So here's an example of the element selector that I already talked about.
But you can go ahead and demonstrate real quick that you could actually affect multiple properties, because you did say earlier that it's one to many. So if you say wanted to change the color, yeah, there you go.
So now it is small and it is red.
Okay.
And then you'll see an example of overriding some of the browser styles if I give it a padding of 0, or a margin of 0. You'll see it because of the rendering engine is not going to, doing this long. You'll see that in a second. So let me go ahead and recreate a small portion of what I had already. I'm going to have a div with a class of columns and a div of a class of column, and then an H2 with a column 1. And then I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this 3 times so that we can show how to select multiple items. So let's go ahead and I'm going to select every element with a class of columns, and I'm going to go ahead and give it a float left. And you'll see I'm going to select everything with the class of column and give it a float left. Sorry about that. I was adding an erroneous S to that.
Yeah.
So that's cool, but some of the cool things they can do with CSS are, like I said, the ability to override elements' properties in more specific contexts. Let's say for my website, I want all H2s to be blue, and I want their font size to be 9 points for whatever reason. So now you see that the H2s are now being all styled because, well, they're all H2 elements, and this selector selects out all H2s. But let's say I wanted to be more specific. I wanted all the H2s in my column classes that you see right there to be slightly bigger for whatever reason. So I can go ahead and say column H2, and I can go ahead and say font size 11 points. So now you'll see that it's still inheriting the blue from the selector that, or the rule that has the selector that is very generic. It's still making it blue, but on my more specific selector, I'm adding or overriding a property called font size, and you see that in effect now that the columns are now the same size as
you could simply add another H2 in that is not being affected. There you go.
So now you see that has the smaller text, that has larger text, but they're both blue. Mm-hmm. Now the way the styles are computed, and computed style is another piece of terminology that you'll be seeing me use a lot, means the final value of all of the properties that an element can contain. And that computed style is calculated based off all of the rules that you have. Now, what's interesting about this rule is that it's no accident that this rule can override this rule. It's not because it's declared lower in the file. For example, if I were to bring it up again, you see that the rule is still being applied. The reason this rule, every property within this rule supersedes the property of this rule is this rule has more weight. And the reason it has more weight is because it has more things, it's more specific about how it selects elements. So that is it's a built-in aspect of CSS that allows you to override elements that are more specific. And it's also very fundamental to understanding how CGS will be implemented.
Okay.
So last bit, I'll go ahead and show just a few more different kinds of selectors that you might see while we're implementing CGS. The first selector you might see is the ID selector. So I'm going to go ahead and say div ID and call this ID something and put a p tag in it. Now the ID selector starts with a pound and ends with the ID that you're supposed to be selecting. So I can say something is going to have a border of 1 pixel solid black, and then something P is going to have a color of yellow. So now you'll see that the something element now has that border, and the paragraph within that element now has that color. Mm-hmm. So the last thing that CGS is going to support out of the CSS specification, and it doesn't support everything out of the CSS specification, but one of the most important things that you need to be able to represent is the idea of a pseudo-selector. And a pseudo-selector is a way to select an element conditionally based off its state during execution. So for example, if I wanted to say, if the mouse is over my something element, I want its background to be gray. Then, if the mouse is over the something element, I want the P tag to have a color of black.
Very
So now
nice.
you see, as I hover over this, things change. So pseudo selectors will allow us to add or create things like buttons or other little bits of interactivity in our application without having to do any scripting or nasty code.
Okay.
So yeah, that's all I wanted to show in this video, just the different kinds of selectors, the basic terminology, and just an example of how CSS relates to HTML. We're not going to be coming back to HTML at all, but as you'll see in the future, CGS does support a HTML-like syntax inside of C Sharp that allows you to define things rather quickly.
Okay, fantastic. Well, with that, that is going to wrap up our introduction to CSS, and we'll be moving on from here to talking about, or at least giving an overview of parsing and jumping into, I don't know, yeah, we'll just start out with an overview of parsing, then we'll go from there. That sounds good. Thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll catch you in the next video.